Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War to 1969 and the tumultuous year of 1968. President Kennedy had adopted Eisenhower's domino theory that said that if communist forces overthrew South Vietnam, they would quickly be overrun and overrun other countries in Southeast Asia. Therefore, Kennedy continued U.S. military aid to South Vietnam. He increased the number of military advisors who trained the South Vietnamese army. By 1963, there were more than 16,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam. They provided training and supplies and helped to create strategic hamlets, which were fortified villages. South Vietnam's government under Ngo Dien Diem was very unpopular. He was educated in France and adhered to the practice of Christianity. Buddhists set themselves on fire in the streets of Saigon to protest his policies. 2 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated, Diem was overthrown and killed by South Vietnamese generals. In August of 1964, President Johnson made use of a naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off Vietnam's coast to secure congressional authorization for U.S. forces going into combat. This was a clear escalation of the war. Allegedly, North Vietnamese gunboats had fired on U.S. warships in the Gulf, but this could actually never be proven. The approval of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave Johnson, in essence, a blank check to be able to take all necessary measures to protect U.S. interests in Vietnam. In 1965, President Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a prolonged air attack using B-52 bombers against targets in North Vietnam. In April of 1965, Johnson decided to use U.S. combat troops for the first time to fight the enemy, which were called the Viet Cong. They were the North Vietnamese. By the end of 1965, there were over 184,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam. Johnson continued a step-by-step escalation of U.S. involvement in the war, hoping to win a war of attrition, which means the winner is the last person standing. American generals used search and destroy tactics. By the end of 1967, the U.S. had over 485,000 troops in Vietnam, and 16,000 Americans had already died in combat. Nevertheless, General Westmoreland assured the American public that he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. So the U.S. government continued to tell the American people that the war was going well. Misinformation from the military, combined with Johnson's reluctance to speak frankly with the American people about the scope and the costs of the war, created a credibility gap. Johnson hoped that a little more military pressure would bring the North Vietnamese to the peace table. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong launched an all-out surprise attack on almost every provincial capital and American base in South Vietnam, over 100 sites all at the same time. And this was called the Tet Offensive, which was actually the Vietnamese New Year. Although the attack took a fearful toll in the cities, the U.S. military counterattack inflicted much heavier losses on the Viet Cong and recovered the lost territory. This is a map which shows the major battles of the Tet Offensive. This was clearly the point where the American people begin to realize that the war is not going well and that the government is not being honest with them. The American victory proved irrelevant to the way the Tet Offensive was interpreted at home. The destruction viewed by millions on the TV news led to a colossal setback for Johnson's Vietnam policy. The Joint Chiefs of Staff responded to the Tet Offensive by requesting 200,000 additional troops to be sent to Vietnam to help them win the war. Diplomats who advised Johnson turned against further escalation of the war, and they didn't want to send additional troops. On March 31st, 1968, President Johnson went on TV and told the American people that he would limit the bombing of North Vietnam and try to negotiate a peace. He then surprised everyone by announcing that he would not run again for president in 1968. In May of 1968, peace talks between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the U.S. began, but quickly deadlocked. The war continued, and tens of thousands more died. The escalation of the numbers of U.S. troops in Vietnam stopped and would be reversed under the next administration, which will be President Nixon. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to study Nixon after we take the AP test. Few years in U.S. history were as troubled as the violent and turbulent year of 1968. The Tet Offensive occurred. President Johnson withdraws from the presidential race. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and riots were taking place across the country. Internal conflicts over the Vietnam War, the continuing race issue, and the generation gap between the baby boomers and their parents caused the nation to come apart. Robert Kennedy was campaigning to secure the Democratic presidential nomination. On June 5th, 1968, he won a major victory in California's primary, but was shot and killed immediately after his victory speech by a young Arab nationalist called Sirhan Sirhan, who opposed Kennedy's support for Israel. After Robert Kennedy's death, the election of 1968 turned into a three-way race between two conservatives, George Wallace and Richard Nixon, and one liberal candidate, Vice President Hubert Humphrey. When the Democrats met in Chicago for their party convention, it was clear that Humphrey had enough delegates to win the nomination. As vice president, he had loyally supported Johnson's domestic and foreign policies. Humphrey controlled the convention, but the anti-war demonstrators were determined to control the streets outside. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley had the police out en masse, and the resulting violence went out on TV across the country as a police riot. Humphrey became the nominee of a badly divided Democratic Party. He was a clear underdog in a nation sick of disorder and protest. Governor George Wallace of Alabama is trying to tap into the growing hostility of many whites to federal desegregation, anti-war protests, and race riots in this campaign. He was the first politician of the modern era to marshal the general resentment against the Washington establishment and the two-party system. He called them pointy-head liberals. He will run for president as a self-nominated candidate of the American Independent Party. In 1968, a new, more confident and less negative Richard Nixon secured his nomination at the Republican National Convention. He selected Governor Spiro Agnew of Maryland as his running mate. Nixon was a hawk on the Vietnam War, which meant that he supported the war, and he ran on the slogans, peace with honor and law and order. On election night, Nixon defeated Humphrey by a very close popular vote, but took a substantial majority of the Electoral College, 301 to 191. The significance of the election of 1968 is clear in the combined total of Nixon and Wallace's popular vote of almost 57%. Most Americans wanted time out to heal the wounds inflicted on the national psyche by the upheavals of the 1960s. This is the electoral results of the election of 1968. You can see the popular vote was only 43.2%. However, the electoral vote was 56.1%, and he had a clear majority. And so Richard Nixon is elected president in 1968. Hope this was helpful. Thanks for listening.